Hi, and welcome to our Anthropology 278 final project. My name is Lily McCuddy, and my group members are Lucy Hopkins-Nickel, Kaya Hanks, and Grace DeBlas. Our topic we will be covering today is racism in the South in the 1940s through the 1960s, or the period of the Civil Rights Movement. This slide will talk about aspects of our topic that relate to what we have been talking about throughout this course. Let's first briefly cover eugenics. Charles Davenport, who I included a photo of at the top, was a eugenist and prominent figure in the eugenics movement in the United States. Eugenics is a theory that says certain beliefs and practices can improve the quality of genes in a human population. This theory is linked to historical and present-day racism. Charles Davenport proposed marriages and births between Caucasians and prevented marriages and births between what he saw as inferior races, typically African Americans and immigrants. Next, we will cover IQ tests and their racist foundations. Robert Yerkes, whose photo is on the bottom, was an American psychologist and anthropologist from the early to mid-20th century who claims intelligence is heritable, fixed, and rankable. He took a position in the Army where he was able to have 1.75 million Americans as testing subjects. Yerkes held inherently racist beliefs, ranking white Americans as the most intelligent and African Americans at the bottom. His testing was highly flawed, as the test greatly differed between different Army bases and even differed between sessions at the same base. Some testing rooms were overcrowded, some rooms were not explained the same rules, and in some rooms people near the back could not even hear the speaker. He also designed two different tests, the alpha test and the beta test, and the beta test was given to people who could not read or write. These tests were often compared to each other, which is problematic because they are not comparable by any means. Yerkes completely ignored social and environmental factors that could affect his data, such as lack of education, access to resources, or poor health, all of which would affect one's score on an intelligence test. Instead, he argued that all of these things listed prior were actually a result of lower intelligence and were further proof that African Americans had lower IQs, ignoring the more obvious conclusion that intelligence or the ability to take these tests is influenced by social factors. Because Yerkes was well known in the field at the time, his testing resulted in the development of segregation laws that restricted education for African Americans and led to further racist beliefs, such as if African Americans were allowed in schools with white Americans, it would lower the intelligence of America as a whole. Now we will move on and provide some background about our topic.
So this slide is just to give some background to see what was happening with the Civil Rights Movement during the 1940s to the 1960s. So to begin, in 1948, Harry Truman signed an executive order that mandated the desegregation of the U.S. military. The first point of this order states, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Next, this eventually leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1957, where President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law, which was one of the first civil rights laws since Reconstruction. Next is the Woolworth lunch counter in 1960, where 4 college students boycotted a segregated lunch counter by refusing to leave until they were served. Over the next few days, hundreds of other people joined them in the boycott. Next was the Freedom Riders in 1961, where 7 black activists and 6 white activists decided to protest segregated bus terminals by riding a Greyhound bus. They faced attacks and eventually jail time in the end. Eventually, the Kennedy administration pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to put regulations in place prohibiting segregation in interstate transit terminals. Next is the 1963 March on Washington, where more than 200,000 people came together to march for civil rights legislation and job equality. This is also where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Next is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was signed by President Lyndon, which guaranteed equal employment for all people and limited voter literacy tests and ensured that public facilities and resources were integrated. Next, in 1965, 600 people marched peacefully in Selma, Alabama to protest the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. and for the 15th Amendment to be enforced. Next is the Voting Rights Act of 1964, followed by Bloody Sunday, which completely banned voter literacy tests. And lastly is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prevented housing discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin. This was the last legislation put into place during the Civil Rights era. All these historic events throughout the Civil Rights era were crucial to understanding the racist foundations and basis for these psychologists.
Hi, this is Grace, and I'm going to be going over some of the supporting material. So the first quote says, "A nonviolent protest that made the news predicted a front-page headline the next day that mentioned civil rights. When protests escalated to violence, that predicted a front-page headline with a word like riot." This shows how people who cover protests, like journalists, have targeted Black people as violent back then, and they still do the same now. Unless the protest is peaceful, society ignores the meaning of the protest and deems all who are a part of it as violent and destructive. The second quote says, "Despite the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, equal protection for all citizens continued to be ignored. The South practiced much segregation, including a lack of voting rights for African American citizens, Jim Crow laws, and politicians who ignored racial violence." This shows how the 14th Amendment did not provide equality, nor did it get rid of discrimination. It led to more racism prevailing in society, and inequalities weren't removed, but instead multiplied. The third quote says, "Black people couldn't use the same public facilities as white people, live in many of the same towns, or go to the same schools. Interracial marriage was illegal, and most Black people couldn't vote because they were unable to pass voter literacy tests." This shows the inequalities that proved that people in power saw white people as superior and made it so that any non-white person would not be given equal opportunity. The system was built to make it hard for Black people to gain their freedom and rights. The fourth quote says, "Whites argued that the biological peculiarities of Blacks made enslavement the only condition in which Blacks could be productive and disciplined. Every perceived physical difference conveniently supported African slave status. Defining disease in racial terms played an essential part in this biological strategy that was enshrined in biomedical research and practice." This demonstrates how scientific racism was a part of slavery in determining the treatment that was given to Black people compared to white people. Scientific racism was a huge part of slavery in the way that just because a person was Black, whites felt it was suitable for them to be inferior as their slaves. The fifth quote says, "Racism is a creation of our own time. It is a new way of separating the sheep from the goats. The old parable in the New Testament separated mankind as individuals. On the one hand, those who had done good, and on the other, those who had done evil. The new way divides them by hereditary bodily characteristics, shape of the head, skin color, nose form, hair texture, color of the eyes, and those who have certain hallmarks are known by these signs to be weaklings and incapable of civilization, and those with the opposite are the hope of the world." This is a reminder of how race is a social construct that we made up, but have made it so that only white people can succeed and have full freedom in society.
To finish off our presentation, I will just be concluding everything that we have talked about throughout the presentation. So throughout the 1940s and the 1960s, it was a crucial time period for racism in the South. There was a lot of aspects and changes in the world that happened due to racism that was being experienced by African American people, especially after slavery. There were multiple acts that were created or passed throughout the time period of 1940s through 1960s, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1964, which both improved voter rights. Not only have acts been created, but also many protests happened throughout the 1960s to help end segregation, such as Woolworth Lunch Counter, the Freedom Riders, and the March on Washington, which all kind of helped to end segregation in all aspects. After someone as powerful as Martin Luther King Jr. being killed, you can see a shift in how the world reacted and pushed to create equality for African American people. Another Civil Rights Act was passed to help equal employment issues for African Americans. We also have eliminated all parts of the literacy test for voters so that pretty much anyone can vote even without taking a literacy test. To finish off the 1960s, we had the last legislation to further end discrimination in housing that included gender, sex, race, ethnicity, etc. Within relation to this class, we have covered many aspects of racism throughout the whole class period and covered such topics as intelligence, IQ, and how theorists believed it connected to races, as well as taking school measurements of different schools that theorists believed had connected to races. All these acts and protests have happened decades ago, which have helped African Americans in the long run, but there are still many things that need to happen in order for racism to completely end.